Hello, so this recording is going to take you through a fundamental economic concept, which is the one of consumer demand. So first of all, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about need. So need is a deficit. We're missing something in our lives maybe, and when we're missing something, we have a drive to meet that missing need, and that becomes a motivating factor. And you will learn more about motivations on a couple of other units. So particularly on your critical studies and events and the consumer psychology for events, which you'll be taking in the second year. So, if we have various needs, but actually individuals, we have to make decisions about which needs to satisfy. We usually have choices. So, for example, I've got two images of events there, and we may want to go to both of them, but perhaps we can't afford to go to them. Maybe we don't have the time to go to them. So there could be various factors that mean we have to make a choice to satisfy our need to attend an event. So there's always sorts of consumer choices going on in the background. Some of you might have come across Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs, and I don't necessarily recommend this as, a model of needs for events particularly, but it is a very well-known framework to help you think about needs. And it talks about needs in terms of this pyramid that begins with physiological needs at the bottom and then moves up to self-actualization or personal self-fulfillment at the top. And the idea of Maslow's hierarchy is you move up through these needs and you have to satisfy the basic needs first. From an events perspective, one of the critiques of this is that actually through events you often satisfy all of these needs at the same time, so it doesn't quite work like a pyramid. So for instance, you may go to an event because you want to be with your friends and family, and that satisfies your need for belonging and loves. And at the event, you might satisfy your physiological needs through things like eating food, drinking. So it tends to often these different needs overlap. But Maslow came up with this theory in I think the 1950s, and he was looking at trying to understand what drives people to do things in life. So it's quite a useful framework to sort of think about there. So from need we get the concept of demand. So I need something. I've got a need deficit, and that will drive demand. And here I've got some examples of different kinds of demand. These are sometimes referred to by slightly different terms. But the first one there, deferred demand. This is people who have the money to be able to do something, but they don't have the desire to buy a particular product or service. These might be the kind of people who could afford to attend your live event, but actually they're not particularly desiring to go to that. And then from a sort of more marketing perspective, we're interested in how to persuade people that they have a need for that particular good or service, in this case maybe in a live event. Then there's potential demand. These are people without the money, but the people who want to go, the desire to buy. And therefore, sometimes we think how it might be possible for these people to be able to buy. Now, one way of doing that in many kinds of service provision is by providing discounts at particular times. So, for instance, you might do early bird discount tickets for a live event to get some people to, pay early. Or, for instance, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme has been enabling people to eat out cheaper on certain days of the week. So, it's a way of actually encouraging people to spend. And then we have effective demand. Now, these are the people with the money who can and do buy and satisfy their needs. So basically, they're the ones who can afford to do the activity and they want to do the activity to satisfy the need. And then, for instance, if we were thinking about people who've come to attend an event, how do we persuade people to actually come back again if it's a repeated event? So how do you persuade them to buy more than once? And there is something known as the law of demand, which links demand and price, which is very important in economics. So I've got a scenario here. So imagine that some new risk laws came into place for live music events. And in order to try to implement them, it required more security staff, and therefore the costs for the music events double. So the question for you is, would you cut back on attendance? Well, for most people, they probably would. Obviously it's going to vary according to some factors to do with your desire to attend and, the income you have to enable you to attend. And actually, of course, we've seen something similar at the moment. So new risk laws have come in place due to COVID-19 at the moment, and I'm currently organising a series of athletics events because I'm a member of Bournemouth Athletics Club, and we have had to actually implement some new risk assessments that have put higher costs for us. Now, so far we're trying to avoid it transferring those costs onto people coming to take part in our athletics events, and actually the club is bearing those costs at the moment, but we are probably charging at the top end of our entry fees, and that could have an impact on people deciding to take part. So obviously you can see there, the people who are less able to afford to attend, there's what we call an income effect. So, they are likely to reduce their demand. And also, if you're thinking about something like live music events, they might cost, in this scenario, cost more relative to other choices. And I've given the example of us going to the cinema there. So what you might see is if one type of activity increases in price, people might substitute it for another type of activity. And that can be a problem. Oops. So you'll also come across something called the demand schedule, and if you go through workbook at exercise 2, it will cover this as well. So this is a record of how much consumers are prepared to pay at a number of different prices, and we all as individuals, we have our own demand schedule, because we all have vary in our willingness to pay for something. But what you do in theory, you would add these individual schedules together, and that gives you the market demand schedule. So say the market demand schedule for an athletics event. And there is this negative relationship between price and quantity. So if we look at that table below, when the price is nothing, you get a lot more demand. So potentially up to 20 people want to come. But when you move that price to £20, suddenly no one wants to come because nobody is willing to pay at that price. And you can sort of see as that price goes up, gradually the amount of people who demand to go to that event goes down. That there's this negative relationship. And we can see that as a graph here. So, you can see that negative relationship. So, where the price is high, the quantity demanded is very low, and then as you go along that curve, that graph, when the price drops, so when the price is at £5 over there, you get quantity of 15 demanded. There are some sort of slightly odd, not really exceptions to that, but that curve will move significantly further to the right for various products which have a certain degree of exclusivity about them. So, collectors, so my partner collects model railways, and, collectors seek out the really exclusive and expensive items, so you tend to see that demand curve shift over to the right. What we use the demand curve for, it helps us making pricing decisions. So we use this in conjunction with other information that we can get about consumers and about our businesses to try to work out where we can make the most profit. But essentially, people generally buy more at low prices and less at high prices. So there are a number of other factors that can influence demand. So for instance, there are things to do with personal tastes or cultural tastes, collectively what society is thinking and feeling about at the moment. And, I said what might influence this? Well, there are things like advertising, what other consumers are doing, what you're seeing other consumers buying, the experience of consuming itself, so you actually enjoy something, you want to buy it more. And there can be things like product development. So, I've got my iPhone here, and obviously iPhone every so often brings out new developments in its iPhones, and that makes it attractive for people to upgrade. Then there's the number and price of substitute goods. Now, I've got a question there, what might be substitutes for attending football matches? Now, you might think, well, is there anything? Well, there could be other sporting events, but there also can be watching football in other formats. So, for instance, through TVs, through going to, venues like pubs and watching football matches. and that could be a substitute. And actually, interestingly, there was a significant international athletics fixture hosted in London that clashed with another international sport event in London, which was Wimbledon. And actually, they made a loss on the international athletics fixture because they hadn't realised that a lot of the people who attend an event like Wimbledon do so not just because they're just passionate about tennis, obviously some will be, but because they like going to a big prestigious sport event. And actually they went to that instead of the international athletics fixture, so it sucked out some of their market because there was a substitute. And then there's the number and price of complementary goods. So complementary goods are goods that are consumed together. So thinking about event examples, events hosted in something like a nice nightclub, alcohol's consumed with that kind of event. So there's a complementary good. If you are going to an international event, say like a festival in Croatia, well then probably air travel is consumed with that event, and therefore, if the price of that changes, that could actually have an impact on the demand for the event. Then we have things to do with consumer income. So consumer incomes can rise, and typically they will then spend on what's called normal goods. There'll be more about that in another slide, but normal goods are ones which behave in this way where if consumer incomes rise, people will generally spend more on them. But then we have this other category that consumers will spend less on, which are inferior goods. Now, I can't think of a good event example, but the classic example is the supermarket own brands, say like the supermarket own brand of cornflakes, as opposed to Kellogg's cornflakes. These are an inferior brand, and as consumer incomes rise, people tend to spend less on these inferior goods. There's also issues about distribution of income. So if wealth is redistributed from the poor to the rich, then we see demand for what's known as luxury goods. So, designer products, for instance, that might go up, prestigious events like Wimbledon. And at the same time, demand for inferior goods goes down. And then another factor is expectations of future price changes. So, for instance, if for some reason people think that something's going to, the price will rise in the future, they, that has an implication on how they buy, and they will hold back purchasing if they think the price will fall. Okay, so sometimes we're aware of possible price changes going to take place, and that can influence our decision making. So for instance, if you think that tickets for an event, if they're not going to sell out, they might sell some off cheaply nearer to the event, then you might hold back purchasing if you've got that expectation. So there are quite a number of things that we can think about there. So now you will need to go and watch some of the other videos that relate to consumer demand and decisions.